We are getting ready to get started on assembling the 350 Pontiac.
Obviously, being a two-man shop, we're checking our work every step of the way, and that includes checking our crankshaft bearing clearances right before the final assembly. So we're measuring the crankshaft again, as well as going through and taking some measurements on all of the bearings that we're going to be using. And here I'm just showing that trick that I showed in a YouTube short a little while back, where you can use a ball bearing along with your flat anvil micrometer to measure each half of your bearing shells. And obviously, a lot of people misunderstood that video. I was just showing that as a trick for kind of the DIY guy, because yes, you can buy micrometers that have spherical anvils and so on, if you prefer not to use a flat anvil micrometer. So we can go through and measure all of our bearing shells, make sure that they're in the required spec. In today's day and age, just the last few years, it's been harder and harder to find good quality parts, so these checks become more and more important every single day with the way things are right now. So here we're installing the main caps, and then we can go ahead and use a bore gauge to actually measure the vertical bearing clearance compared to our crankshaft main journals. And yes, you can use plastic gauge, but it's more of an indicator than a precise measurement of clearances, and it's a product that works great for a DIY builder, but with the tools available to us in our professional shop, it makes much more sense to actually measure our clearances to get some actual hard numbers and make sure that everything is in spec. You'll notice that we're doing all these checks with the caps fully torqued, but before I torque them down, you make sure that you've got that cap seated properly so that we don't run into an issue like the original builder had on this third cap where they broke the corner of that cap off. We're also doing away with the old rope rear main seal, so we ordered a one-piece seal from BOP Engineering. The seal is designed to be cut in one position so that it can be installed, since the crankshaft was not originally designed for a one-piece seal, and it is recommended to check the fitment with the cap torqued, and if needed, to remove a slight amount of material from the outside diameter of the seal in order to make the lips of the seal fit together perfectly. The original fitment was close, but I did actually end up sanding just a little bit of material off of that outside diameter to make the fitment just a little bit nicer there, so that we get a good seal. Before installing the crankshaft, we like to get the camshaft installed. It's just a little bit easier to get in there without banging it around against all the cam bearings if you don't have the crankshaft in already. Here I'm using the Driven brand engine assembly grease that is awesome for break-in, especially on these flat tappet camshafts, which, if you know anything about our industry, we're having a lot of trouble with right now getting flat tappet camshafts to break in. And I went ahead and greased up the rear main seal as well, and then to install it, you just kind of have to spiral it over the flange there and get it into place on the crankshaft before setting the crankshaft in place. But before we set the crankshaft in, we're going to go ahead and lube up the upper bearings there using, this is Clevite 77 bearing guard assembly grease. We also opted to fill the anti-rotation holes from that original rope seal with silicone. The guy from BOP Engineering said on the 350 you really don't have to, but you can if you want to, just as an extra peace of mind kind of thing. But, you gotta not go overboard with it, because what they end up having happen is people put way too much in. Had my dad help me get that crankshaft set in there with the hoist and keep that rear main seal in place so that we didn't damage anything. And then we go ahead and lube up the cap side of the crankshaft so that we can install the main caps. And again, before we tighten down any of the bolts, we're making sure the caps are fully seated so that we don't break a cap like the last guy did. And we're going to go ahead and start getting the main bolts installed with just a light amount of oil on them as a lubricant. We're going to go ahead and bump the crankshaft back and forth a few times to align that thrust bearing before torquing down the main caps. With the dial indicator, we can measure our crankshaft end play, and we're sitting pretty with about 4 to 5 thousandths here. Moving on here, we're going to go ahead and get the camshaft thrust plate installed so that we can move on to getting the timing set installed. This is one of our Engine Pro camshafts and timing sets that we sell on our website and eBay store, and while it's not going to be insanely radical, we are going to go ahead and degree the cams, so I need to get one of our pistons and rod assemblies installed in order to do that. Here I'm showing how you can use the top of a flat top piston to square up the piston ring in the bore to check your piston ring end gap with a set of feeler gauges. And with one piston installed, I was ready to get the degree wheel on so that we can degree in the cam. I think I'm going to do a video later on a different engine just about degreeing in the cam since we're making this video quick, but here I'm showing using a stop to get our degree wheel set up on true top dead center. If your degree wheel isn't on true top dead center, all of your measurements are going to be inaccurate. In this case, we have the indicator zeroed at max lift, and we're taking a measurement at 50 thousandths before and 50 thousandths after max lift. You might be tempted to just rotate the crank around until you see the indicator kind of top out at what you think is max lift, but you're not going to get an accurate measurement on the actual degree. By taking the average of these two measurements on the intake lobe, we can find the intake center line, which came out to be about 107.5 degrees. This actually puts us about 1.5 degrees retarded based on the camshaft spec sheet, and after some thought, we opted to take advantage of the plus or minus 4 degrees of cam adjustment our timing set provides and advance the camshaft by 4 degrees since we prefer to be a little bit advanced over being retarded, especially over time as the timing chain wears. Having installed bigger intake and exhaust valves in the head, I went ahead and put an indicator on to check our piston and valve clearance. And while it's not always the case, your exhaust clearance is typically going to be closest at around 10 degrees before top dead center on the exhaust stroke as the piston chases the valve shut, and on the intake at about 10 degrees after top dead center on the intake stroke as the valve is opening following the piston down. And we had all kinds of clearance, so we're good to go there and ready to move on to getting the piston rings installed on all of our pistons. There are plenty of different opinions in the industry about the orientation of your piston ring end gaps, and I would say the most important thing is to make sure the gaps are offset from each other and not in line from the top ring to the second ring and so on. But drop a comment and let me know what your opinion is. Finally getting ready to get the rest of the piston and rod assemblies installed, so we're getting the bearings in. We like to take a good amount of that assembly lube and just rub it right along the cylinder wall there, and then we can get our pistons installed, making sure we have the bolt boots on so that we don't ding up the crankshaft as the rod is going down in. And then it's just a matter of having the right ring compressor on there and getting it squared up nice to the deck so that you can just take a light rubber hammer and just lightly tap that piston right down in, get the rings to go in the cylinders, and if anything's not going, you don't want to force it because you don't want to break something. It's just best to take it slow and do it right. Obviously, before installing that assembly, I put some lube on the bearing and the connecting rod, and here we're going to lube up the crankshaft side so that we can get the cap installed. And with the rod bolts themselves, we're using the ARP Ultra Torque fastener lubricant that they recommend using with their product. And again, we want to get that cap seated well before we start really cranking down on anything. Bring the bolts up evenly on both sides and get them torqued in place. The rest of the process is pretty similar, just paying attention along the way to make sure everything goes smoothly and we get all 8 pistons and rods installed with no damage or anything like that. I want to take a quick second to thank everyone for the support. It's honestly been a bit overwhelming for us, but it's all good. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and don't forget to turn on notifications to follow with our small business journey. I have some fun ideas for the channel and the business in the future, and it's great having all of you guys following along with us. That's the bottom end wrapped up, and man, is she looking good. Now let's move on to the top end. This is kind of overkill for what this engine is, but I went ahead and CC'd the heads to get an idea of what our chamber volume was. And then I went ahead and put the deck bridge on each of the cylinders so that we could see where our pistons were coming out, and they all came out at about 40 thousandths in the hole, with the exception of the one connecting rod that, if you remember, did have a spun rod bearing, so I ended up taking more material off of that rod's mating surface, which did shorten the rod by, looks like, about 4 thousandths, which is more than I thought it would be. But it's nice when you take these measurements and find each one to be within such a small value of each other, because it gives you the confidence that the crankshaft was machined correctly, the block decks were machined evenly, and so on. That all being said, it is going to be a pretty low compression engine with around 7.7 to 1 static compression ratio calculated with all those measurements. With the head gaskets in place, we're going through and getting our cylinder heads mounted on the block and getting the bolts in, and obviously following the specified torque sequence to get our bolts torqued up to the correct specification. Moving on to getting all of our flat tappet lifters installed, again using a liberal amount of that driven grease that we talked about earlier on the camshaft. We are installing a set of roller tip rocker arms from Comp Cams on this set of cylinder heads here, and we wanted to go ahead and just double check that we were happy with the valve train geometry we had using the stock length push rods. So we did mark the tip of the valve with a dry erase marker, as well as using a dial indicator here to get a view of what it's looking like at various different points, zero lift, half lift, and max lift. We were happy with the way everything looked, so we're moving on to getting the pushrod guide plates installed so that we can go ahead and get all of our pushrods in and our rocker arms installed. Again, we're using the driven assembly grease on all of those critical wear areas, both ends of the pushrods, the tips of the valves, and so on. Now setting the rocker arm in place, and with the lifters for this cylinder on the camshaft base circle, we're going to adjust the self-locking nut down to 0 lash by lightly turning the pushrod as we tighten down the adjustment nut until we just feel tension on the pushrod, and then we're adjusting 2/3 of a turn past 0 lash. Next, we're going to work through the firing order and make this adjustment on each cylinder, making sure that we're doing the adjustment with the lifters on the base circle of the camshaft so that everything is coming out correctly. With all of that wrapped up, I went ahead and got the valley pan installed here to close up the valley of the engine. We opted to ditch the inferior cork gasket that comes with your gasket set for a nice even bead of silicone, which in our opinion will provide a much better seal. So we're just getting it set straight down right there on that bead of silicone, and there's 2 bolts that hold it tight, and you can't go too tight on them because you'll just collapse the tray. Just nice and snug, and we did put a little sealer around those as well. Kind of jumping around a little bit because we were waiting on parts, went ahead and got the oil dipstick tube in place and got the windage tray installed, and then we can move on to the oil pump. We have a new pump going in as well as a new pickup screen, so here we're installing the screen into the new oil pump. And you don't want to forget to get the drive shaft installed before putting in the oil pump with the gasket there. I forgot to get a clip of it, but we did prime the oil pump using that same assembly lube like we always do. That's what we do on every engine that we build. And here I'm painting the backside of the harmonic dampener so that I can go ahead and get it installed because it's easier to paint it before you install it as opposed to trying to get to the backside once it's installed. Same thing on the front of the timing cover, which our customer decided to go with a new replacement timing cover, which was a great idea. The old one was just completely worn out. And here we're making sure the timing chain is well lubed. The front surface of the block is a little bit corroded, so we're just putting another light coat of silicone right there on the gasket. That just helps really seal it up. And then getting the timing cover slipped right over those studs. The original timing cover had a couple of dowel rings that helped align it. This cover doesn't, so we're putting the balancer on so that we can use it to kind of help get that front seal surface centered. I asked my dad to help me hold it in place and get it centered well before getting it tightened up so that it was positioned the way we wanted it to be. I did have to slip the balancer back off to get a little bit easier access to torque all those bolts in place, but once we got them torqued, we were able to get the balancer back on. I don't know where my footage went of installing the pan gasket and getting the oil pan installed, but as you can see, we did get it installed here. We put all new bolts in, again, the Felpro gaskets that came with our gasket set, and we're moving on to getting this thing painted. As you may remember from the teardown video when this engine came in, it was not painted the correct color for a 1968 V8 Pontiac. But obviously, being a restoration, we're going back with the original color here, this really pretty blue, just a light blue metallic Pontiac blue. The customer brought us a set of new chrome valve covers, so I went ahead and used the old ones just as an easy way to cover that up and not have to worry about taping it off so that I could paint. With the painting wrapped up, we got the tape off and we're ready to set in place the Edelbrock Performer intake manifold that the customer is going with to replace the stock intake and ditch the 2-barrel carb that originally came on this engine back in 1968. The customer is going back with the carburetor, but down the road we think an electronic fuel injection setup would really improve the drivability and performance of this engine. So that's something they might consider in the future as an additional investment. Obviously, right now there's a cost savings benefit of going with a carburetor, and it'll do just fine, but just later down the road if they want to upgrade, that's something they can keep in mind. Getting ready to button up the valve covers, we're going through making sure everything's lubed up one more time and everything's ready to go before we cover this thing up. I know there's a lot of guys out there who don't like the chrome these days, but call me old school, this thing looks beautiful with a set of chrome valve covers, the aluminum intake, and that original Pontiac metallic blue paint. I mean, seriously, just look at this thing from every angle. I love this color, and it just looks so dang good. Pretty much the last thing we're going to do here is get some oil in this thing and get it primed. Again, we're going with driven BR30 conventional break-in motor oil. With the flat tappet camshaft, you must use a dedicated break-in oil or you're going to have issues. The oils that we have today in today's world just don't have the additives necessary to break in a flat tappet camshaft, so we always recommend going with a dedicated break-in oil when you are breaking in an engine with a flat tappet camshaft. What you saw there was us spinning the oil pump and turning the engine as we're spinning it, making sure we have oil pressure, and then we're wrapped up. So I had to roll this thing outside to get it in the daylight so that we could really see how this thing shines. I mean, what a difference compared to what this engine looked like just a couple of months back when we first tore it down. Talk about a glow up. This thing came in covered in dirt, grease, and rust, just beat down, and it's leaving the shop show car ready both on the outside and inside.
Well, that wraps up the series on the 350 Pontiac. I wish that I had a dyno so that I could actually run this and let you guys hear what it sounds like and all of that. But from here, our customer is going to take it over. They're going to have their mechanic install it in the car and so on. We'll see if maybe down the road they'll, bring the car out or let us know if they're going to a show or something so that we can go out and see it. And if that's the case, then we'll try to get some video of it, actually running. But in the meantime, this kind of wraps up the series. So if you guys enjoyed, we had a lot of fun doing this, and I'd like to get into doing more, just kind of, not that this was a custom build, but kind of doing some custom builds and taking, doing a full series on them, just like we did on this Pontiac engine, because it was a lot of fun and answered some questions for everybody, and I think everyone else, enjoyed. So don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.